Dr. Nora FISHER-ONAR will be our moderator in this session. Associate Professor of International Studies at the University of San Francisco. Thank you very much for joining us. That's very kind of you, Dr. Fisher. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim Mustak, for organizing this exceptionally timely event, and also for bringing together such a genuinely global set of voices. It's quite, operationally, it's not easy to pull this off, and it really does justice to the scope of the issue which we're tackling today, which is the rise of global populism, and how that interfaces with global power shift and new trends in international order. So thanks to you and the organizers, and of course the participants and audience. With this panel, we are lucky to have several panelists who have expertise on multiple world regions. They also share an abiding interest in the interface between sort of material concerns, international political economy on one hand, and normative concerns like democratic resilience and human rights on the other. So I will follow my marching orders and invite the speakers to present for maximum 20 minutes each, and I'll alert you in the chat box when you're 5 minutes from time. And then I will also aggregate questions. I believe there's a chat box, actually. I will aggregate questions if participants want to plug them in as the speaker is speaking. And of course, we'll also devote 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Marina Nora, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the V-Democratic Institute of the University of Gothenburg. And she's an expert on both Europe and I believe Russia, and will be speaking to us on the third wave of autocratization and the case of democratic reversals. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to share my screen. I hope it works. That always, I'm sorry, technical difficulties.
It's inevitable. We've all been in that place in the Zoom room.
Oh, it tells me that Zoom may not be able to record my contents of the screen until I quit. I may start talking, maybe someone can share the screen. That would be if I quickly send the presentation to someone. Would it work?
Yes, you can send to Ibrahim and he can forward us.
Yeah, that would be great. For some reason, I'm really sorry. I don't know why it's such. Or maybe we just let's do someone else start speaking, so that I don't take the time and we switch the order. Would it work?
Marina,
shall we ask Professor?
I will send the presentation to someone. Sorry, I'm really sorry.
By the way, if you don't mind, shall we ask Professor BACCHUS if he would like to start, because he is on a travel. He may not have enough time for that, but just this is my idea. Just if you don't mind, Ms. Fisher, you can ask to him.
Yes, of course. Professor BACCHUS, are you available to switch places with Dr. Nora?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Let me do the honor of introducing you very briefly, and then the floor will be yours. So you are the Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs and the Director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the School of Politics of the University of Central Florida. You're also former chairman of the WTO Appellate body, and you're going to speak to us about the nexus of globalization, economics, rule of law, and human rights when it comes to the populist challenge.
Well, thank you so much. It may also be relevant to this topic to mention that before I was a judge at the WTO, I was a member of the Congress of the United States. And for those who are wondering, I am a Democrat, and people are always too polite to ask. In the United States, if you're a former member of Congress, then people assume that you lost, and that's why you left, because otherwise, why would anyone leave such a cushy, easy job? I remain undefeated here. I left of my own free will, and then later went to the WTO. This is an extremely critical topic. So I was very happy to accept the invitation when my colleague Naim Kapuchu, who I believe is on this call, recommended that I participate. And I am happy to be with all of you. Stuart Patrick and a couple of my other friends and fellow travelers from my global do-gooding have also been on this call. I look forward to the opportunity to get to know more of you. If you would like for me to come visit you someday, just let me know. I continue to globetrot. Let me say at the outset that I am someone who believes we have a duty of optimism. In this, I'm influenced by the philosopher of science and much else, the late Sir Karl Popper. I think that as human beings who are destined to try to live together, we have an obligation to try to be hopeful and forward-looking in our perception of where we're going and where we're likely to get. So I'm someone who has devoted my entire life, as I think all of you have, to various forms of service, because I think that humanity is one and we need to act as one in trying to fulfill the full flourishing of our striving and struggling species. Right now, we have some unprecedented challenges that we're simply not meeting. Climate change is one. I was one of the legal advisors to the climate COP leading up to the Paris Agreement. I was one of the members of Congress more than 30 years ago who started efforts in my own country to address climate change. I'm still working on that issue. More broadly, there is the need for sustainable development, with which you're all familiar. I've been much involved in the efforts first to create the Sustainable Development Goals, and now against increasingly great odds to try to fulfill them. I know that many of you are doing the same. I'm also an academic, and I have written a great deal about international political economy, international law, and I've just finished a book that is now in peer review on what I see as the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. I hope it will be published later this year. The sad truth is it's quite hard to be an optimist these days. I've appreciated the fact that a few of you have weighed in your remarks by saying, well, I think we need to be a little bit more optimistic. And I agree with that. But clearly, it's a challenge. And the challenge is one that we face not only in my own country, but as has been made clear in the remarks and presentations already today, is a challenge that exists in different ways and in different contexts throughout the world. The danger, I think, in being so pessimistic about populism is that we might accept the premise that more popular involvement in our politics is necessarily harmful. This to me is not so. To me, that's an elitist view that would confirm the views of many populists that people like us are elitist, especially me. I have WTO stamped on my forehead, not to mention some of the other things I've done along the way. But it seems to me that the potential for more public participation can be positive as well as negative in the world. I think we need to look at what's happening politically and geopolitically in the world in the light of that. I recall here decades ago when I was a graduate student at Yale in history. I was studying the history of the United States, and particularly the history of my native South, and read and thought a great deal, wrote papers on the populist movement in the United States in the last decades of the 19th century. And all in all, in my judgment, and that of many historians, the populist movement of that time in the United States was a positive influence on the broadening and deepening of American democracy and justice. The populists themselves did not win the presidency, but many of their ideas were adopted by the Democratic Party and to a lesser extent by the Republican Party of the time. Mention has already been made of Teddy Roosevelt. Ideas such as the direct election of senators, the radical notion of having a personal income tax, and much more were originally populist ideas. They were part of what were called the Ocala demands that were the result of a convention of the Populist Party in Ocala, Florida in 1890, just about 75 miles from where I sit right now in Orlando. So it seems to me that the challenge is one of galvanizing popular participation in a way that produces positive and not negative results. As we all know, most of what's happened thus far over the past decade or so, as we've seen in the aftermath of the global recession and now exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, an emergence of dangerous forms of populism. In my own country, in the past few days, the putative nominee of one of our parties for the presidency of the United States, a man who has already somehow served as president, has said that some immigrants are not people, a shocking statement of dehumanization, and has predicted a bloodbath if he does not win the election. These are not things that have traditionally occurred in American presidential politics, yet they're increasingly commonplace, and the coarsening and the worsening of our politics has come upon us over the past 20 years and is gradually gotten worse. And I fear that some of these predictions that are being made will happen if the forces that currently control populism prevail in my country. There is, as has already been noted, both left-wing populism and right-wing populism. Right now in my country, we have mostly a manifestation of right-wing populism, but there's a potential also for left-wing populism. And as has already been noted, no one has tried to engage with people in any way that would truly respond to the legitimate concerns that many ordinary people in our country do have, not even my party. And to the extent that they seem to have tried to respond, I would submit that for the most part, they responded in the wrong ways. It's, in my view, a great idea to tax me and other upper income people more to provide more services for those who need them. But it's not a good idea to engage in trade protectionism, which only shrinks our economy in the long term and does not strengthen the competitiveness of our people in the world in the short or the long term. And no one has tried to lead in this country in the way, for example, that a century ago Franklin Delano Roosevelt led. And that's the kind of leadership that I think America needs. We don't have it, and we're unlikely to get it in this election. But I do think the potential is there for something positive. Now, to me, this is most likely to come through more democracy and not less, but it's more likely to come from a different kind of democracy than currently prevails in most supposedly democratic countries. Of course, as you know, we have many countries that claim to be democracies, but are not. It's merely a pretense. They're nominal democracies, and of course, they need to become real democracies. Getting them from here to there will not be easy. And then we have democracies that are democratic republics that are more or less genuine in how democratic they are. Our friends in Indonesia, where I'll be flying later today, are about to face a test. Having had a democratic election, they've elected someone who in the past has not always seemed to be supportive of democracy. We'll see what happens there. In other places, we've seen challenges. I know we'll hear later about what's happened in Latin America from one of the experts in the world who's on this panel, but look at Brazil going back and forth. Look at what's happened in Venezuela and in Colombia and Argentina and elsewhere in South America.
You have about, yes, you're at the 5-minute point.
To me, what we need to do is have what I would call a strong democracy. I borrow this phrase from the late political philosopher Benjamin Barber, and this is one that is much more participatory. And I would wed this democracy to much more intensive attempts at human development and at overall sustainable development. Here, of course, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, but the notion of sustainable development exists separate and apart from the goals, however we may define or label them. It's the concept of a full human flourishing in a way that will enable all people to fulfill their greatest potential. And in the context in which we, more than we have done in the past, vastly more, respect the natural world and understand that we are part of it. This is simply not happening. To do this, we need, of course, efforts within democracy to promote affirmative kinds of citizenship and participation. In my forthcoming book, I have a lot of suggestions about what that might be, but these must be means that will either create trust or restore trust where we've lost it, that will provide the right kind of leadership as opposed to the finger in the wind and often bought and paid for leadership we have now in our democracies, and will thereby help create the political will to make the great transition we must make toward a sustainable zero carbon world. I'm going to stop there, and I'll stay as long as I can to be able to answer questions. Again, my appreciation for the invitation, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists will say. I know I will learn a great deal from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this very rich intervention, and we look forward to hopefully hearing some of your suggestions about how we can have more affirmative participation moving forward. Now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Kurt WEYLAND, who is joining us from California like myself. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you're in Texas, I believe. That's right. It was in the former panel, there was a Californian. So Dr. WEYLAND, although he is situated in Texas at the moment, brings to us immense expertise on Latin America and Europe, which he studies an ambitious comparative perspective as a professor of politics at the professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin. And so the floor is yours. And again, I will alert you, if your chat box is open, actually, I can alert you in writing when you are at 5 minutes left.
Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this interesting discussion of populism. And so what I will try to argue is that the threat that populism poses to democracy is real and serious, but it is not as severe as people have depicted it. So some type of good news in line with what Professor BACCHUS said before. So essentially, the big concern, of course, arose, especially in 2016, with the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump, because the United States is widely considered the paragon of liberal democracy. So if an autocratic populist gets elected even there and then tries to concentrate power to push aside checks and balances, this is of great concern. And the idea was that if even in the United States something like that can happen, other countries are much more threatened. And of course, we can easily think of emblematic cases of populist leaders who ended up actually asphyxiating democracy. Alberto Fujimori in Peru, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, all come to mind and are, for example, raised in the famous and excellent book by Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Died. So great concern. So what I do is I try to figure out how serious this concern actually is. And so what I argue is that the strong focus on those cases where populist leaders have actually strangled democracy can be a little misleading, because there were many populist leaders that actually ended up being in government, but who did not actually destroy democracy. And so we have to have a fuller picture of populism. We have to look at a comprehensive set of populist cases and then see how likely are they actually to get away with, to manage to destroy democracy, and what are the conditions under which that happens. And that's what I'm doing in that book that's just coming out from Cambridge right now, Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat. So, and what I do there is I start with my political strategic definition of populism that essentially highlights populism as revolving around personalistic plebiscitarian leadership. So personalistic means you have these big domineering figures, these leaders who think they have a divine mission to carry out what they perceive as being the will of the people. And so for that purpose, they want to have power, they want to have clout, they don't want to face constraints. And that is inherently a problem and a threat for democracy, because democracy, especially in its liberal version, tries to constrain personalistic authority. It tries to impose checks and balances to prevent the abuse of power. And so this populist personalism naturally runs up against one of the core features of liberal democracy. The second feature of populism in my definition is that they base their quest for power and their exercise of power on plebiscitarian mass support, which means that they try to establish a direct personal emotional connection to largely amorphous, broad, largely unorganized mass of followers. And they do this in this direct personal contact rather than through organized, disciplined kinds of organizations and parties. And that is a problem too, because given that there isn't a disciplined, reliable base of support, what populist leaders try to do, they try to supercharge their appeals. They try to emphasize that they are fighting against dangerous enemies of the people, to induce or rally around the flag such that the people support them against these dangerous enemies. And that is a problem because it undermines civil, electoral, democratic competition. From the populist perspective, democratic competitors are not legitimate alternatives, but they're enemies and adversaries to be fought. And so essentially, populist leaders turn politics into a war, and that is a problem for democracy. So I agree with a lot of the established literature. I agree with a lot of concerns that for these reasons, populism is inherently a problem and a threat for democracy. But as I just said, when you look at the actual record of what populists in government do, I examine in that book 40 cases of populist leaders who won power in Latin America and in Europe over the last 3-4 decades. And what you see is that among those 40 cases, only 7 actually ended up destroying democracy. So it's not that it's that common. It's not that it's that easy. It's not that when a populist leader comes to power, democracy faces a very high risk of being overturned. So then the issue, of course, is once we have that finding, what are the specific conditions under which populists manage to destroy democracy, under which they can really enact their power-concentrating aspirations? And what I emphasize there is, and it's related to that initial definition of populism, 2 factors are very important. As I said, personalistic leadership is constrained in democracy by institutions. So conversely, where institutions are weak, that personalistic leadership has more capacity for expansion, they have more ability to concentrate power. So the weaker institutions are, the greater is the actual threat of populism. So that's one factor. And we see, of course, that where institutions are strong, like in Western Europe or in the United States, populists end up not doing very much damage to the institutionality of democracy. The damage occurs in regions where institutions are weaker, like Latin America and Eastern Europe. But while institutional weakness is a necessary condition for the populist destruction of democracy, it is not sufficient. And you can see, even under conditions of high institutional instability, populists do not necessarily manage to destroy democracy. Think of the recent case of Pedro Castillo in Peru. Peru, by the time Castillo surprisingly won office in 2021, had sunk into high instability with a number of presidential crises, turmoil, and whatever. Peruvian democracy was precarious, but nevertheless, Pedro Castillo did not manage to overturn Peruvian democracy. So institutional weakness is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. The other condition that is necessary as well is, and it's related to my initial definition of democracy, is there are opportunities for these populist leaders to boost, to extend their plebiscitarian mass support. So that's the plebiscitarian side of populism. Where populist leaders win massive, intense support that turns into a steamroller, they can essentially get away with undermining and destroying democracy. Now, nobody, for example, nobody can stop Bukele in El Salvador has like 80 or 90% support. But it's not that easy for a populist leader to get such overwhelming mass support. And what I highlight in my research and in my book is there are essentially, it depends on largely given exogenous conjunctural opportunities that enable some populist leaders to boost their mass support, whereas others who don't have those opportunities can't do it. Now, interestingly, those opportunities come in 2 kind of opposite versions, 2 opposite types. One is a massive resource windfall that in the case of Hugo Chavez and similar Evo Morales in Bolivia and Rafael Correa, they got from the global commodities boom. So you have oil exporting countries. The government has control over the oil industry. During the global commodities boom, these populist leaders had enormous revenues with which they could roll out generous social programs. They could buy off business people through juicy contracts. They could buy off politicos by allowing them to steal and be corrupt. And so the bonanza that they were gifted by the global commodities boom enabled them to get massive support. And you can see that Hugo Chavez wasn't all that popular in the first years of his government. 2003, 2004, the global commodities boom, his popularity very substantially increased, and he was essentially unstoppable. So that's one factor. And that is, interestingly, the decisive factor that enables left-wing populists in Latin America to destroy democracy. And you see the logic here, because left-wingers want to improve the situation of the people. They want to bring mass prosperity. They want to lift people out of poverty. They want to diminish inequality. If you have this massive resource windfall, you can do this kind of thing. And so you see the logic that this condition, enormous resource windfall, helps left-wing populists to destroy and strangle democracy. Now, the opposite type of conjunctural opportunity, which in some sense is more paradoxical, is acute, severe, but resolvable crises. And what you see there is essentially what operates is the mechanism of loss aversion, which is a basic human motivation. So if a country, think of an example of an acute and severe but resolvable crisis. One is hyperinflation. And hyperinflation strictly defined as price increases above 50% per month. So when a country suffers from hyperinflation that imposes enormous costs on vast sectors of the population, they suffer big time. If a populist leader with his boldness and his determination to get the problem under control, if they actually manage to end hyperinflation, with which a drastic adjustment program you can do fairly easily, they are the miraculous savior of the people. And loss aversion induces people to give them vast support. So like Alberto Fujimori had very high support. Other presidents who managed to resolve hyperinflation had pretty high support. That factor is especially important for right-wing populists, because when you think of it, the main appeal of right-wingers is order and stability, restore order and stability. They benefit from crises. And so you see in the parliamentary systems of Europe, the condition that was decisive for Orban and Erdogan to destroy democracy, but not for Kaczynski, not for Mejia, not for Fico, not for a lot of other populists in Eastern Europe, was a sharp economic crisis. 2008, sharp crisis in Hungary. Orban gets elected with a supermajority, can pull full steam ahead. Erdogan, 2001, deep crisis in Turkey. Erdogan wins, and he can move ahead. Kaczynski, Poland is doing well. No big crisis, no big majority, and Kaczynski couldn't do it. So, in the parliamentary systems of Europe, economic crisis is the decisive factor, the additional necessary condition for the populist destruction of democracy. Latin America, presidential systems of government, firmer checks and balances, more of a separation of power. One crisis isn't sufficient in the Latin American countries to enable a populist leader to destroy democracy. What you need in Latin America is, in some sense, even worse, even more extraordinary. It's the coincidence of two acute and severe but resolvable crises. Think of Latin America, not that common for right-wing populists to destroy democracy. It was Alberto Fujimori who, until Bukele, was the only Latin American president to manage that. And Fujimori did it because he ended both massive hyperinflation and he managed to decapitate the shining path guerrilla insurgency. So Fujimori resolved both a serious economic crisis and a serious public security crisis. And what the book does, the book has about 30 case studies of populist leaders, and it does a systematic compare-contrast. And you can do that very nicely in the Latin American cases, because Fujimori, two crises that coincided, destroys democracy. hyperinflation and a big public security challenge. Carlos Menem in Argentina, hyperinflation, he got high support, he got one re-election, and then term over, you're out. One crisis wasn't sufficient. Hyperinflation alone doesn't do it. Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, public security challenge, he made good headway, he had high support, he got one re-election, next re-election, you're out. He couldn't run again. And so you see one crisis, Fujimori, both hyperinflation and public security crisis, you resolve them, you move forward, and nobody can stop you. Menem, one crisis can do it. Uribe, one crisis can do it. Presidents who didn't face a big crisis or couldn't resolve a crisis couldn't do it. And so the only other case where right-wing populists in Latin America destroyed democracy is Bukele, because he benefited both from COVID and he was surprisingly effective in getting COVID under control and limiting the damage. And of course, he's benefited from a big public security crisis, the brutal stranglehold of gang crime over the population. Bukele made serious headway against both of those crises. He has 80–90% support. Nobody stops him, and he destroys democracy. But what you see is this: it's not that easy for populist leaders to destroy democracy. It depends on the coincidence of two types of necessary condition: institutional weakness and special conjunctural opportunity. And what that means, in the 1.5 minutes that I have left, what that means is advanced industrialized countries don't have to worry very much. Donald Trump was an autocrat. Donald Trump wants to destroy American democracy. Institutionally speaking, he made very little headway in his first government, and I predict during his second government, which is unfortunately likely, he will make very little headway again. People are worried about Marine Le Pen, about Geert Wilders, about they're not going to do much damage to democracy. I mean, Berlusconi in Italy was the only populist leader for a long time who held government office in a Western European country. According to Freedom House, the quality of Italian democracy improved during his government. Why? Because the opposition mobilized more participation. They reined him in, and Berlusconi, who was in government for about like a total of 10 years, 3 terms as prime minister, really didn't do much damage to democracy in Italy at all. So the people of the United States or Western Europe, you can sleep tight. Latin America, Eastern Europe, more trouble. And the book in the conclusion also talks about 4 of the Asian countries, and it tries to provide an overview. And the basic message is what is in the little circle down here: countering global alarmism. There has been too much alarmism about populism, oh, how democracies die and black cover, and everybody are like really worried. It is a problem. It is a threat. I'm not trying to downplay the threat, but it's not as bad. Democracy is stronger, more resilient. People cling to it, people defend it, and democracy has way more capacity to survive the challenge of populism than I think people have, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very cogent, elegant, and also empirically very rich assessment that gives us a framework to think about the democratic resilience at the interstices of optimism and alarmism. I'm not sure that a 17.5% success rate is something that I find entirely reassuring, especially when it's combined with a universal will to destroy democracy on the part of the populists. That seems to be a constant across all of the cases that you mentioned. But I do hope you're right. And now we'll turn to Dr. Nora.
I hope it works this time. Can you see my screen? Okay, finally. All problems happen unexpectedly as usually. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I would like to base my current presentation on the most recent democracy report that we produced at the V-Dem Institute, and I called it Global Trends for Democracy and Autocracy, to really see how much changes there are in the world. So this year's democracy report is called Democracy Winning and Losing at the Ballot, and winning because we have cases like Brazil, but we also have cases where democracy clearly loses, and that corresponds also to this year of elections, super year of elections. So where we are in terms of democracy in the world. So if you look by country-based averages, we are back to 1998. But this is, if you see by the confidence intervals, there overlap and there is some uncertainty about that. But if you look by population-weighted averages, and that is how much democracy there is in the world for the average global citizen, then we are back to 1985. And we also looked at some averages, also territory-weighted averages and GDP-weighted average, and you see a similar picture. And that means that democracy is regressing. So we in Democracy Report, we quite often focus on population-weighted averages because we think of democracy as the rule by the people, and that means it matters how much democracy it is for the average person in the world. So if you look at this perspective, and then since 2009, and that is almost 15 years in a row, then the share of people living in autocratizing countries has overshadowed the share living in democratizing countries. If you look in terms of democracies and autocracies, there is a simplified version. You can take the same liberal democracy index and electoral democracy index that we use in V-Dem and create a simplified picture in terms of autocracies and democracies in the world. And there you see that, like in simplified terms, you have 4 different types of regimes. And then, of course, there are some overlaps in terms of gray zone, what we call, this is when confidence intervals overlap, making the classification more uncertain. But some of those parts are very large boxes. So you have like large of electoral autocracy box and electoral democracy. And this is just to get the grasp very simplified version of what is happening in the world. And if you look at this perspective, then you see that since early 70s, the share of democracies were increasing and electoral democracies until approximately early 2000, and then it started to decrease. And by the same time, if you look in 1973, there were 87 closed autocracies, and then they were decreasing for quite a long period of time. But at a certain point of time, they started to increase again. Here, if you look for the last 10 years only, then you see that the number of closed autocracies has recently become even larger than the number of liberal democracies. At the same time, we see that the number of electoral democracies is, for example, increasing, but that is largely due to the fact that liberal democracies are downgrading. You can look at the same picture looking only on population-weighted averages, and there you see that the share of people living in autocratic countries is increasing, and that is happening mostly during the last 20 years. So that's partly, half of that is, of course, the downgrading and autocratization in India, but there are also other large countries. So again, comparing to the last 20-year perspective, you see that 20 years ago, we had roughly half of the world population living in autocracies, and right now, by population weight, it is 71% of people in the world lived in autocracies. And if you look which aspects are getting worse, then what we do, we look at middle indices. This is sub-indices that go into democracy, aggregated democracy index. And then you see this is for 2013. And if you are above the line, that means that things are getting worse. And you see that almost all of them were above the line. That means that things were getting better for countries in 2013. But if you look now for 2023, almost all of them are down. And most affected here are freedom of expression and clean elections. Those are the, in these countries, you see that freedom of expression is declining in 35 countries, where improving in only 12. And for clean elections, it's declining in 23 countries and improving in 12. And this, the same perspective, if you look at very indicators that go into aggregate indices, and we have 600 different indicators, and what we do, we basically calculate which one of them are declining substantially and statistically significant, and take the top 10. And if you're above the red line, it is top 20, and if you're above the red line, it is top 10. So you see that the most declining indicators, this is freedom of expression and elections this year. So this means, and then you see that countries that decline the most, this is 45, above 40, and that means that those are the aspects that are attacked the most, and probably the aspects that attack the first when countries starts to autocratize. In terms of regime change, we identify that there are 60 countries in episodes of regime change across different regions this year. And here is the map, and you see that they're spread over the world. So if you have shades of red and orange, that means that things are getting worse. If you have shades of blue, that things are getting better. In terms of population, this is the same perspective. If you're below the line, things are getting worse. If you're above the line, things are getting better. And the purpose of showing this is that you see that like below the line are mostly large countries, except for Brazil and Thailand that you see like all large countries. So this is the reason why we so much look by population weighted average and democracy level. A number of autocratizing and democratizing countries in the world. Here again, the last 50 years. And you see that since 1973 until mid-90s, there were a lot more countries that were democratizing. And in 1992, you have 70 countries that were democratizing at the same time. And that was the time when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. So we thought that this is. And after that, the number of countries democratizing started to decline. And at the same time, this is something that we identified since 1994. That was the start of the third wave of autocratization. So the last approximately 20 years, we see that things are getting worse. So. And in terms of share of world population living in autocratizing countries, 20 years ago it was only 7, and right now it is 1/3 of the world. And in numbers, it was 11 countries 20 years ago, and now it is 42. And important story here is that like 42 countries that are now autocratizing, 28 of them were democracies at the start of their episode. And out of those 28, only 15 remain democracies in 2023. What we do this year is we distinguish between autocratization episodes that are standalone, that means that they start in a regime that was relatively stable, and so-called bout-on autocratization that you can think about it as failed democratization. So those are countries that were democratizing, but at some point democratization failed and turned into autocratization. So standalone autocratization, those are countries like Hungary, Greece, Poland, India. So the important point here, so you see the line that we try to show here the year. This is the pre-episode year. This is before they started, and where they are in 2023. And the important thing to figure, those are top 10, and like at the beginning 8 out of 10 were democracies, and right now 8 out of 10 autocracies. So in terms of bout-on autocratization, you can see those are cases of failed democratization. So you hear that everything those changes happen in all spectrum of liberal democracy index. So you see cases like South Korea, but you also at the bottom you see cases like Myanmar that were improving at a certain point of time, but then reversed, or Haiti. And in terms of an important point here is also that like 5 out of those 10 cases during the last 10 years were mentioned as top 10 democratizers. So cases like Armenia, for example. And this is where the process of democratization was reversed. And again, we see the same story here that, again, freedom of expression and the media are attacked, but also elections are now increasingly under attack. And this is something new because usually this is the core institution of democracy that usually comes late at a stage during autocratization. We also have good news, some democratizing countries, and this year we have 18 of them, but again, compared to 20 years ago, there are less. So 20 years ago, there were only 35. And it is only 5% of the world's population. And Brazil is the largest of those cases, and it makes more than half of these. Again, we distinguish cases as standalone and U-turns. Standalone are mostly smaller countries, like Seychelles, for example. It's one of those top democratizers of the last 10 years. But here, again, this is the reason why we so much focus on population-weighted average, because, of course, we appreciate, we're very much happy for what is happening in Seychelles, but, like, Seychelles is a tiny island with 90,000 population, but then at the same time, you have India that is autocratizing with 1.4 billion people, and for the world, India, of course, means a lot more than Seychelles. And the most interesting case, I think, for this story would be also democratizing countries, so so-called U-turn democratization. So these are cases where autocratization process was halted and reversed. One of them is Brazil, and we identified this year ongoing cases. There are 9 of them that are now reversing, but there are also cases like Thailand, cases that we wrote about last year, like Zambia and Maldives. And here we, at some point, we started to do research more focused on those cases of U-turns where autocratization were reversed. And what we did, we identified all cases of U-turns since 900, since the beginning of the 20th century. And what we see is that on average, during the last 125 years, 48% of all autocratization cases are eventually reversed. And if you look at the last 30 years at cases that have already stopped, 70% are actually turnaround, coming back to at least the same level of democracy that was there before autocratization started. And 93% actually get back either the same level or even above the same level that was. So that shows some I would say some sign of hope, because it means that democracy is in fact a lot more resilient than we support. And just to make sure that it's not only, when we call autocratization cases, we mean not only cases that start in democracies, but any kind of movement from democracy to autocracy. So it may also start in autocracy and just becoming more autocratic and then reversal. And this is something we had in the last year democracy report. We looked in detail at some of those cases, those what we called 8 democracies bouncing back, and we tried to identify which aspects helped to reverse those cases. And that was very quick and dirty analysis, so it's not like a proper research analysis, but just to give a sense of what was happening in those cases and why they reversed. And so we identified 5 elements. One element was large-scale popular mobilization, and that is stories like South Korea, so really like millions of people going to the streets and protesting against autocratization. Then also judicial independence, and it was something that about the strengths of institutions that has already been mentioned by Kurt. So this is something where the judiciary stood up. So they did not allow something what Nancy Burnell called executive aggrandizement. So this was something where judicial independence was really important, the strengths of institutions. Then there was also unified opposition and opposition strategies against autocratization. Then there were also critical elections or other critical events. So this is critical points in time around which actors could unite and coordinate their actions. And of course, there was also international democracy support. That was less important in many cases, but at least we could find some signs that they were important in other cases. So that is also something that probably we should do proper research on. And the last part of the report, and I probably go very, very quickly about it, is the year of elections. So this is very quickly, if you look at all countries that are holding elections this year, we see that 31 of them are declining on democracy index and only 3 of them are improving. And out of those 3 are actually, all 3 are U-turn cases. That means that they were autocratizing during the last years and they're only reversing the trend of autocratization. And so in total, you have this picture where actual elections will be held in rather like at least half of those elections will be held in countries that are already declining on democracy index. I think that's something that's important because elections are very critical events that could either help to stabilize autocratic regimes or to turn things around. Yeah, thank you. And this is where I end.
Thank you so much for this incredibly rich and rigorous global picture that is also dynamic, and we see diachronic trends that inspire dismay, as well as trends that are really interesting food for thought in connection with Professor WEYLAND's arguments about democratic resilience and the possibility of U-turns. As well as specification of a number of critical sort of enabling conditions or mechanisms that spur countries to go in one or another direction. So very, very rich indeed. And we already have, I also want to thank you for being very timely in your comments. That was really an amazing amount of content that you lucidly shared with us. Now we have several questions in the boxes or in the chat box, and because Professor BACCHUS may have to leave early, I'm going to ask him the first question, which is also the first posed, and it regards the possible or probable election of Donald Trump, re-election of Donald Trump to the White House, and how it may impact some of the key themes upon which Professor BACCHUS spoke about. So the intersection with kind of more meaningful re-enlivening of democratic traditions through popular engagement, and also how that connects with sustainability and climate change. These are key elements of your remarks. How does the possible return of Donald Trump to the White House impact those dynamics?
Thank you for the question, and thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you. The fact that I'm an optimist causes me to hope that Professor WEYLAND is right about what would transpire in the aftermath of the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and should he be elected, I'm going to do everything I can personally to try to make certain that Professor WEYLAND is right. I'm not quite as sanguine as he seems to be about the resilience at this point of our democratic institutions in the United States. And I'm also gravely concerned about what the impact would be of the return to the White House of Donald Trump on our international institutions. First of all, in terms of globalization, I think you could see from the second Trump administration a fierce and foolish return to really very aggressive protectionism. What we've seen under President Biden is polite protectionism. Basically, the Trump policy from Trump's first term without the insults. President Biden is a good and decent man, and he doesn't think it's a particularly good idea to insult our friends and allies in the world. Donald Trump sees things differently. But if you look at what Trump has proposed in terms of an economic policy internationally in his second term, and if you look at what both the Democrats and the Republicans are embracing in their own policies, I fear we could see an unraveling of the world trading system beyond what we've already seen. I believe Trump would, at this point, go ahead with his previous promise to try to withdraw from the WTO, and I don't see the United States standing up forthrightly as an affirmative leader in other international economic institutions. In terms of the rule of law, Donald Trump doesn't care about the rule of law. I think the domestic test will be whether we Americans care about the rule of law sufficiently to prevent him from undermining it domestically. But we're already seeing the undermining of the rule of law internationally, given what's happened under the Biden administration. And I think we can see even worse forthcoming, excuse me, from the Trump administration, should there be a second one. The view of international law that the Trump thinkers have is that international law is useful only when it seems to serve our selfish ends. Otherwise, we can safely ignore it. In terms of human rights, don't get me started, both domestically and internationally. I see a second Trump administration not only is not standing up for human rights, but is undermining it. I've been thinking about Professor WEYLAND said, and I have just ordered his new book. I've read his previous books and look forward to this one. I recall when, and I'll conclude with this, I can recall when Octavian, 2,000 years ago, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, changing his name to Augustus. He did not abolish the Roman Republic. He kept all the trappings and the semblances of the Roman Republic in place, but he made them into a fiction. And he had the sole authority in Rome. I think that's more likely to be the direction of the Trump administration. Next time around, when he'll be shorn of what he thought was the need to seem more or less respectable at the outset of his first try at the presidency, we'll see whether Americans will permit him to do that. I certainly hope that he won't win the election, and I hope that we won't stand for that type of autocratic behavior if he becomes president again. Thank you again all so very much. And pardon my coughing. I have a bit of a cold.
Thank you so much for this historical and yet timely, given that it was just recently the 15th of March and the Ides of March, which remind us of the assassination of Julius Caesar. So not only can we draw insight from our contemporary comparative global perspective, but also from a sort of a broad intertemporal analysis of how populists assert power across time and space. I'm going to interpolate between the those who have their hands up and the chat box. So I'm going to give the floor now to Irina von Wies, and then I'll go back to the chat box and then come back to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nora, and particularly thank you to this excellent panel. I am very obviously heartened by Professor WEYLAND's optimism. However, I have a question regarding one factor that I think you mentioned only in fleeting, and that is the impact of our climate emergency and the resulting global population movements that we are inevitably going to see. Now, as you may know, not only in the United Kingdom, but across the world, and notably in the United States, migration is used by populists and possibly as their number one argument for particularly national right-wing populism. And I don't personally see how over the course of the next years, possibly decades, unless we find some miraculous turnaround in our environmental policy, how this is going to get any better. So I would welcome your views on how you think the climate emergency and migration is going to impact on populism and the resulting problems. Thank you.
So in my view, clearly migration is one of the main arguments that populist leaders use to win power, especially in what you would call Western democracies, the United States and Western Europe, because migration patterns go first and foremost in kind of the most striking way, also based on the biggest difference in people who move and the recipient country to the, call them advanced industrialized Western countries. Now, according to my argument, those countries benefit from a great deal of institutional stability, and they benefit from a comparatively limited degree of economic and social volatility. And so my prediction would be that migration helps populist leaders to get elected to office, like Trump or, who knows, Marine Le Pen or Geert Wilders, all these people. But when they're in office, institutional strength and resilience and the comparatively limited volatility of economies and societies won't give them the necessary conditions to seriously undermine or destroy democracy. I think all these Western countries have long consolidated democracies. Checks and balances are comparatively firm, where you have parliamentary systems and checks and balances are institutionally attenuated. You have often very strong, independent judiciaries. In addition, you have vibrant, resourceful civil societies. The other thing is, when you look at the conditions, Western countries have very diversified economies and a lot of fiscal capacity. So that means they're not going to benefit from a huge revenue windfall. There is not a single sector like, oil in Venezuela that can just flood the country with petrodollars. And they're not that subject to really profound and acute crises. You see, for example, when COVID hit, the United States, even the liberal United States, did so much compensatory spending that allegedly average incomes actually increased during the COVID pandemic. So even if there is a sudden tremendous shock, these countries have the capacity to make up for it and not expose large sectors of the population to the terrible losses of something like hyperinflation. And so I would say that migration will benefit populist leaders in coming to office, but it will not enable and allow them to then use their attributions and power in office in order to undermine and strangle democracy. I still think that the Western countries are quite safe. And one additional point I wanted to make, in a historical perspective, because we talk about historical perspectives, one thing that hardened my view about the resilience of democracy. So my last book was about the interwar years. And there's, of course, the great book by Agnes Cornell and Jürgen Möller and Sven-Erik Skarning that looks at the interwar years and emphasizes that none of the established democracies were done in by communism and fascism. The interwar years were much more troubled, much more crisis-ridden, much more turbulent than the contemporary period. And even during that time, consolidated democracies uniformly survived. And so sort of by implication, I think the current troubles, which are significant, but not nearly as severe as during the interwar years, are not going to do in the United States or Holland or France or the consolidated democracies of what we would call the West. So.
Thank you so much for this thoughtful and sort of historically important, but also very much grounded assessment in sort of rationalist institutionalist claims. It does, of course, raise the question of one of your the sufficient part of the necessary sufficient conditions, which is the need for the ability for populists to position themselves as saviors in times of crisis. And so, your arguments are very to point when we think about materialist institutionalist forces at play. Of course, there's cultural dynamics at play in the capacity within the new media environment to manufacture crises and to cultivate emotions that may or may not correspond with the material features which you're describing. So in that context, maybe if I just raising that thought and invite you to also address one of the questions which asks, in a European context where we have multiple elections on the horizon that may lead to the rise of populists who do indeed manufacture crises regarding migration and other other elements of the culture wars. Do you have any examples of how we might counteract these more sort of culturally packaged forms of populist provocation?
So if I can respond briefly in two ways. First, in my view and based on my research, the claim that populists can manufacture crises, which especially Benjamin Moffat made in his 2016 book, I think is exaggerated. I think there's always a margin of maneuver, a margin of exaggerating, politicizing, emphasizing, dramatizing, and all these kinds of things. But according to my research, I mean, people feel whether there is a real crisis. And crisis is one of these overused terms. Everything is a crisis. I mean, there are millions of crises out there. For crisis to have any analytical bite, we have to have a fairly clear definition. So like hyperinflation. And when you look at this, I mean, a real crisis seriously hurts and threatens large numbers of the population indirectly, like hyperinflation, or think of the gang crime in El Salvador. Allegedly, people couldn't leave their house without paying protection money to a gang. That hurts and bites you every day in your daily life. You can play up migration and it's an invasion and whatever. How does it hurt me in my daily life? I mean, people in Texas, they hire migrants, including illegal migrants, to mow their lawn and take care of their babies. I mean, this is not like that they have to pay protection to migrants who camp out in their front yard, right? So this is a very different kind of thing. And you can play it up and you can exaggerate it, but it doesn't have nearly the same kind of impact. The second thing is just to, how should I say that? It might be controversial, but I think on that migration issue, I think mainstream parties are well advised to go the path of like Danish social democracy or what Sweden is doing now. I think you have to accommodate the concerns of a large segment of the people that is concerned about migration. I'm a migrant, I benefit from migration. So this is not my personal view, but I think in a democracy, if in the United States or in the Netherlands or in France, if 20, 30, 40% of the population are concerned about migration and push for limiting it, I think democratic competition in a simple Downsian model will advise some accommodation of that, not in terms of the culture war and all the rhetoric, whatever, but I think especially giving that part of the population some kind of idea that the government is in control. I think what especially bothers people and what drives them into the arms of populists is the sense that this is a uncontrollable, in Trumpian terms, invasion, and that illegal migrants overrun the country. And so I think mainstream parties are well advised to do whatever they can to contain and limit migration, and especially to move it from illegal entry to going through the legal channels. And, as I say, it might be controversial. There's a lot of debate, and I'll be legitimating what these populists do. Democracy means if a large segment of the population holds certain views, parties are advised, at least some, to accommodate that and move in that direction. Simple kind of Downsian logic. So.
Thank you for that. And I will now give the floor to Albina
Azmanova. Yes, thank you. I agree with much of what Professor WEYLAND has said. However, we seem to be assuming that there is a democracy that is being threatened, while it might be just the opposite, that our ailing democracies generated populism as a reaction to the failure of democracy. You might remember there was a study by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page about 10 years ago, a very good research, two professors, established researchers, claiming that was the oligarchy report, establishing that the US is not a democracy, but an oligarchy where economic and social policy is decided by organized groups and policy political elites representing, you know, big business. So it just struck me how we are talking as if there is this healthy democracy where they're, you know, to protect from populism. So it seems to me that unless we address the policies that these oligarchic liberal regimes have put in place and generated mass precarity. And in my book, Capitalism on Edge, I established that populism is a reaction to this massive precarization of the population that neoliberal globalization has generated. So unless we, unless these drivers of populism within our liberal oligarchies are addressed, there is no chance for for stopping the far-right populism. This is what
so this is
can I just was the question for Professor WEYLAND?
That the very premise of the study of whether populism poses danger to democracy presupposes that democracy is this healthy thing that is being endangered, while it has been in fact ailing, and that failure of democracy is the reason of the rise of populism.
May I? I'm not sure who you addressed the question to, and I would invite all of the panelists to think about this really interesting statement that I believe also Kasmude and Cristobal have formulated of populism as being endemic to democracy and reflective of what you've brilliantly called sort of the oligarchic liberal discontents. And so I wanted to ask if in your respective, you have, the three panelists have these fantastic recent research outputs. So, across the two books and the reports that Dr. Nora also invoked, do you see evidence for this, this angle on the problem of looking at populism as endemic to democratization and to democracy? And if we turn the lens that way, does that change in any way our prescriptions for how to grapple with the populist challenge? But I would like to give the floor to Dr. Nora to engage with this first, because there was a lot of causal mechanisms and enabling conditions that she discussed in her data. And so perhaps she has some insights from that very large databases, and then to Professor WEYLAND and Professor BACCHUS, both of whom also, of course, have written important new books on this topic.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment a little bit. When we talk about autocratization, for some reason, people think that we are talking about democracies, only democracies declining and becoming autocracies. When we look at data, what we actually see is that a lot of autocratization happens in countries that are already autocratic, and they become even more autocratic. So if you look at countries like Turkey, Russia, Hungary, which has already been classified for autocracy for quite some time. So if we distinguish, it may be a little bit misleading what I present, because we always look at the top 10 countries. If you look at the top 10 countries, of course, you will have a couple of democracies over there. And since they kind of declined, even at Hungary or whatever, they started at such a high point that eventually the decline is, the magnitude of change is so large that they end up being on the top 10. But in terms of data, countries in the top 20-30% more or less stable. I mean, a large portion of the world is actually stable. So of course we have like autocratization happening in countries like Greece, but again, among liberal democracies, Greece is rather an exception. So I would say that I don't see any contradiction to what, for example, Professor WEYLAND presented here, because if we are talking only about democracies experience decline, then this is one story. But if we talk about autocratization as such in general, then this is a very, very alarming topic for countries that are already autocratic. So countries like Russia would be an example where you become even more and more autocratic, and countries like Myanmar and all that. So I think that is something that like we should keep in mind. So we are not talking about democracies autocratizing only, but we are talking about all spectrum of regimes from autocracies to democracies, and then autocratization is any movement towards becoming like more autocratic.
Professor BACCHUS, do you have any thoughts?
Well, my thought is that Professor Asmanova is largely right. And the fact is, we've failed, at least in my country, over the past 30 years to do what is needed to be done to make certain that ordinary Americans are able to continue to prosper and to feel that they have a future. I'm all in favor of free trade, for example, but we have done very little in this country to make certain that the benefits from trade are enjoyed by all Americans. Too many of the benefits have gone just to the people at the top. This is a domestic issue. It's not a reason to abandon trade. It's a reason to do what we need to do domestically. And as I said at the outset, I believe that our democracy needs to be much more participatory. In this, I go back to my youth. During the 60s and 70s, when a lot of us were saying that, and I've said it all along, even as I've served in various positions of responsibility and governance. I don't think we have what can rightly be called the best form of democracy in our country or in most of the West. And of course, as I've already mentioned, there are a lot of pretend democracies in the world. And ask China, and they would say, well, yes, we're a democracy too. It says so right in our Constitution. But, looking at what we actually have, I would go back here, not to the Romans, but to the ancient Athenians. Their democracy had plenty of shortcomings. Women weren't allowed to participate. Immigrants weren't allowed to participate. And, oh yes, they had a whole lot of slaves who also were not allowed to participate. But if you were a citizen, you were permitted to participate in a direct democracy. Amazing for that time. And if the Greeks, if those Athenian citizens were to look at our American democracy today, they would say exactly what Professor Asmanova has said, that it's an oligarchy. There are reasons for this. The antiquated structure of our political systems, such as the Electoral College, gerrymandering, unlimited political spending, increasingly undisclosed. There are many, many reasons for this, but I have to say that the end result is that it's an oligarchy in which there are two competing parties that, to varying extents and in different ways, are indebted to that oligarchy.
All right, thank you for this analogy and this inside-out eye from intertemporal perspective, how the ancient Greeks.
I recommend her book to everyone. It's quite good. So,
Thank you. And Professor WEYLAND, look forward to your response. Bearing in mind, we have one more question in the audience, and you've also been asked by one of the participants in the chat box to weave in an engagement of Dr. Nord's ideas as well, if it's possible to pull that in. We have about 5 minutes left. So if you could share your thoughts, and then time permitting, we'll take one last question, and then we'll wrap the session.
So very briefly, I see, how to say, I use a very conventional definition of democracy. And so I think what you have in mind is problems of democratic quality. And clearly representation deficits have an impact on the electoral chances of populists. Of course, the paradox is that if you're worried about oligarchy, a number of the populists who have been elected are the biggest oligarchs of all, like Trump or Berlusconi or Babiš in the Czech Republic. And of course, they come with the promise of empowering the people, and they never empower the people. They always empower themselves. So if populism is a response to problems of democracy, it certainly makes the problems worse and not better. The fact that besides oligarchy, I think what is in some sense a more underlying problem in modern democracies that will create, I think, increasing space for populists is technocracy, because the modern world is so complicated and problems are so difficult that mainstream politicians come with 1,000-page-long bills and people don't understand. And you have an issue like immigration in the United States, which hasn't been resolved in like 30 years. And here come Trump and say, easy, build the wall. And so that gap between people's understanding of the tremendous complexity of the world and the simplistic solutions of populism, I think, will provide increasing room for populists to come to power in the future. I think that's one of my main concerns in a long-term perspective.
All right, well, let's have the last question to Anne Benamara. Please identify who you're addressing the question to.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's not really a question. It's just a follow-up comment on what Dr. Albena and Professor, I think he left us, Pukek, something like that. Sorry, I don't remember the full name. But yes, so you were speaking about American democracy. And since its very foundation, the American political system and American democracy has been subject to extensive criticism. So since the Declaration of Independence, we hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And by that time, all men, it did not include like women, it did not include the poor, it did not include African Americans, slaves, of course. But here, the fact that American democracy is an elitist democracy cannot be denied. And this distrust towards the mob through the Electoral College and through the different policies that have been introduced throughout history, cannot be denied. Actually, another just follow-up comment on the fact that populism was historically positive. I would not actually say that, but historically speaking, we can consider populism as an empty signifier, a concept that can be filled with different meanings, different concepts, different interpretations. But this concept, historically speaking, was or did contain this nativist element. And for example, let's take the case of Patrick Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan was one of the most, let's say, unfamous populist leaders in the history of the United States. So he was actually the speechwriter of Nixon, and he was the electoral candidate for the 1992 electoral campaign. And Patrick Buchanan was a replica of Donald Trump. But by the time, he appeared in the 1990s, people were still like influenced by the ecstasy of the New World Order and the liberal market capitalism. So, his ideas of like nationalism, nativism were not influential. And, he even wrote a book entitled The Death of the West, in which was very shocking, to the audience of Fukuyama at that time, and the post, Soviet order America and American civilization.
Thank you, Amna. Could you maybe sum it up?
Sure.
We're out of time.
Sure. So the point is that, you know, populism was not something that is positive, historically speaking, and it wasn't, and it hasn't been something like new. So it has been under the surface, let's say, for decades, but now the stage has been set for populist leaders to thrive and to appear and to be actually influential and known at the public and at the international level. So that's the point.
Thank you so much. So I think that's a fitting note on which to close. We have populism and there's an empty signifier, but we've had 3 presentations that have populated, as it were, that empty signifier with immense empirical and analytical richness. And I think we've all learned a great deal from this conversation. So I would just like to applaud the contributors. And I believe we did lose Dr. BACCHUS, but he will hopefully hear our applause on his way to the airport. So thank you so much. And thank you also again to the organizers. And I'll turn the floor over to Ibrahim Öztürk now.
Thank you very much for all those insightful, comprehensive contributions, discussions. With your great contributions, we have successfully came to the end of our first day in our program. But please note that we have 2 more wonderful panel discussion tomorrow. For those who have time, we would like to see you together with us and continue our discussion tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good evening, good night, good morning.